Hello, my name is Brock Davignon. Got my little microphone up here. I was a student of Ted Danielewski from 1976 to 80 and 82 to 84. Ted was a fellow in terms of his making good films great, good stories better, with his 77 Elements of Dramatic Form. Became aware of me back in 76 and 77 when I was computerizing up the BYU Motion Picture Studio, which was away from the main Brigham Young University campus in Provo. And this sounds funny in the year 2023, but there was nobody there who knew what a computer was. And I had designed this idea. I've been working with computers as a programmer since 1970 in Fortran and COBOL. These are punch card computers with 80 columns and 10 numbers on each column to sort data and so forth. Punch tapes and other things could run robotic tractor tread fire hoses for the rural metro firefighting insurance company that began handling 3 million people's fire service at the time. And I was looking for things for percentages you earn finance to do, as opposed to rigid fees or lump sum fees for vital services, including education. And I was learning satellite technology and creating video replay assist, so you didn't have to do rushes and dailies of expensive film development to see if the actor's face was covered by their hand for another take or not. And the cost savings there was good. The wiring and everything in every studio in the world at the time, and pretty much still is, has many things on the same circuit. And I got it down to where there was one computer on one circuit, or anything else that plugged into it. That system was on a separate circuit where lights are, or as the light goes plop, you know, they fried every chip in your computer. And at that time, computers were about the size of portable ones were like a suitcase. And the number of things that happened at BYU. In 1984, a Professor Cable, who taught advertising, public relations, and marketing research, I was in a class about the same time as Ted Danielewski, where he had the portable computer magazine list of 30,000 names, and we were to do a survey on what the problems were and how these luggable computers could be improved. And so I noticed something strange, that less than 1% were women, where normally at the time 50% were women, and things like Working Women magazine might tell you to wear a lead smock with these cathode ray tubes, especially if you're in childbearing years. And nevertheless, that was very lopsided. So I got curious and I researched where these women were, and I'd call them up. And then see, my luggable is like a heavy packed suitcase, and I bust my heels going up stairs at Motel 6 when I'm going town to town doing accounting for power plants in Kansas. And I called, there was at least one of them in every state, 2 in Texas. And so it was a very small sample, but the feedback I got was that the corners tear my dresses and my hose, the protruding screws wreck threads, they are tacky, weird purple colors. That was compact at the time. And they don't match anything. And I don't need to carry a television set around. All I need is something like a liquid crystal display watch at the time. And help me out here with what kind of designs you want. Well, I want 80 columns instead of 40 like some accountant. I need to write business letters occasionally. And I can do it a paragraph at a time. I can scroll. So all of these innovations, I designed a rounded corner beige thing with what we have a screen that would come up what we think of as the laptop today. And I sent it off for our real client project-based learning that Richard Cagle was doing to the Advanced Products Division of Hewlett-Packard in Corvallis, Oregon. And they'd already had a campaign where they were going to try to do something like this, but they had completely forgot about women. And notice their stats are 99% are men, 1% women. So they, instead of taking my recommendations on, nuns bouncing down the street with phone modems or Superwoman popping into a phone booth to stick her phone modem in it for some reason, they picked an androgynous-looking male in a jumpsuit and cut off his head and his legs, and he's got this carrying case that's small, and they thought that would do it. Well, they did put real chips, and they designed them there, and within 6 months they had this out on the market, and there were 66 luggables at the time, and they cleaned the market. And then the ladies at HP deserted to Nissan, who made daisy wheel printers at the time. It lasts for about a million characters, although they were guaranteed for 10% of that. And so they had a good rep. And there went another third of the luggable markets. Within 3 years, there were hardly any luggables left. I think K-Pro and Compact were the only survivors for a while. But I learned to listen to the ladies. And one of the interesting things that, the talk of the professors was to Ted Danielewski that, I could solve these strange things and I would confront the most strange, difficult spikes in statistics and so forth. I got a B in the research class because I didn't have a big enough sample to match the statistic requirements for an A grade. So I thought that was kind of humorous in retrospect. But real client project-based learning, the one fellow that was a great advocate of it, they all were, but the one who excelled the best, I thought, was Ted Danielewski and Erwin Goodman. I'll tell another story about how he learned from Danielewski on this. But with Ted, directly, this is a brilliant man who was slightly disorganized, but he had an organized mind that forgot nothing. And his 77 elements of dramatic form in the course of a class was there. And he had asked me to computerize up across 4 genres, which was romance, thrillers, westerns, and comedy, the 77 elements of dramatic form. And we took a 70-foot piece of butcher paper and divided it up into 4 main columns and some headings. And I thought up most of it and then presented it to the other students of the professional actors, directors, screenwriters workshops that Tad ran. These were all 400, 500, and occasionally 600 level classes. Some great cinematographers came out of the time, Reed Smoot and others, Lance C. Williams, which Lance wound up running the Paul workshop after Tad died, and still is. And the expertise that Tad had and was used to having basically created an environment where CEOs, major film studio chiefs, Mike Medavoy, Bill Birch, Vice President of Commercial Industrial Films for Universal. They would come up for sometimes a 1-credit class or a talk or a session throughout a semester, sometimes once a week. And that was some of the best 1-credit classes I ever took. Learned a great deal. And one day, you have to understand that Tad had 3 philosophies. He was a great deal like Coach John Wooden of UCLA. If somebody's hot on the team, you play to that basketball player. If Lou Alcindor or Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was hot, you play to him. If he goes cold, you play to somebody else. And if nobody's hot, you play to the whole team until somebody emerges, and you do that. And in screenwriting, you have a main character and an antagonist. You might have some sidekicks for each to find out what the hero is thinking. Is it a comedic sidekick, a sounding board, or is it a dynamic duo like Batman and Robin? You know, these were things that he would explain to us about the refinements in dramatic form to make you think, well, does your script have this or not? You know, and if you don't, you ought to get one, and if so, what kind? You know, so he nevertheless understood that the march of technology through his lifetime was going to proceed, and that a lot of the television classes and other things and satellite uplinking and so forth was what we were being taught. And so my combination of doing this market research thing for the creation of the laptop and wiring up the studio over the years there and creating the Silicon set, which was sort of a funny title we gave it. Pardons to any ladies who have augmented biology. But the problem was for him, these people would come to him with a technological problem that often had something to do with marketing. And Arch L. Madsen, M-A-D-S-E-N, was probably one of the most unknown, but one of the more significant people in the 20th century in terms of distribution in radio and television. He was a creator of Radio Free Europe, which initially had the OSS and then the CIA behind it, State Department, but he rapidly learned and had a hostility towards government-subsidized media as, you know, creating monsters that you didn't really want to have. So, prior to this time, I had also sold digidial adapters to pay for a couple of years worth of research I wanted to do around BYU without necessarily being a student, but I still worked with TAD. And some of the interesting things that have come out of it all these decades later, if you look at Dramatica version 10 or Dramatica.com, these are the questions of the 77 elements of dramatic form. Maybe they added a few more, to get you thinking about quality and how you're telling your story, which was Tad's big mission in life. And he was very much into the battle between good and evil, but his quiet mission at NBC and NYU, BYU, and later USC was to get this understanding of the battle between good and evil. And one day we were talking about how one could take South Korean magazines, cut off the binder so the pages are loose, pack them into sort of a rice paper rocket that would disintegrate over North Korea, and you'd have all this high-tech free market capitalism raining down on basically militarized slave farmers all over North Korea, and it would create sort of a psychic dissonance. Well, Arch Madsen recognized that America was not the United States, and that American television was not United States propaganda television. And although people with tears in their eyes would tell him how they had, you know, survived the gulag in Siberia and went out with their guards to listen to Radio Free Europe, he knew his coverage was kind of thin in Asia, and the Vietnam War had shown that people could be told things like, the Americans are going to steal the electricity from the richest country on earth, Laos, and they had built a couple of hydroelectric dams along the Mekong, but they weren't asking anybody about it. And so the communists used this as a way to indoctrinate every little kid that, you know, they're coming to steal your electricity by dams they would build, you know, so like they're state government dams, so, you know, go figure. But this is what was going on, as ridiculous as it seemed to anyone who understood how hydroelectric dams can be paid for by stockholders and so forth, and the voluntary permission of landholders and others that could be worked out. But that wasn't what was happening. And so National Geographic could print all of the proposed dams along the Mekong. Today, the Chinese communists are damming up the upper Mekong, and they've got communist Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia all mad at them. And but that's what had happened. So to open up a discussion, he knew that just the interests of the United States could be questioned. And he wanted to do a radio-free Asia. And he came to Tad Danielewski, have you got anybody who can figure out how I can make this self-supporting without tax money? And he said, sure, I think I just got the guy for you. And I was one of the founders by this time for 1984. 3-4 was for about 4 or 5 years, one of the co-founders of the International Society for Individual Liberty. Now, Tad's philosophy was threefold. He was kind of a democratic socialist, which I would, question his logic of how Hitler and Mussolini could get elected. And I would deal with the fact that he loved to do collaborative private intellectual property team projects, and we had to all agree to this beforehand, so nobody would say, "Oh, you stole my script idea," when in fact they'd contributed 3 or 4 ideas to it. So this was what he called Quality Y. In that vein, he brought Arch Manson down, who for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints had basically created Bonneville International, so that the satellite transmission of the church's at least semi-annual conferences would go on. It also acted as sort of a holding company for a bunch of radio stations over 50,000 watts, so if there was an earthquake in California where there's more Latter-day Saints than there are in Utah, they could communicate with them by saying, we own the station, excuse me, we're going to talk about how the welfare program is going to work for the Latter-day Saints here. And in that trend, this was a very imaginative, powerful man, but he was stumped. How do I do this for basically talking to people who can't buy anything in North Vietnam, North Korea, and so forth? And so he asked Tad, and Tad put him with me 1-to-1. And real client project-based learning is usually such that a head of a charity, a corporation, a pizza place, whatever it is they needed would be handed. But our professors would get these really colossal projects like tourism for communist China. It was one PR professor's class, and she ran her own ad agency and PR agency, and this tourism bureau, the Chi-Coms, wants ideas. And so with very little research, you could learn that the communists in China would make life living hell for a person who just talked to an American like they had cooties, and they were mentally polluted by this "hi, how are you" thing. And they wouldn't let Americans off of buses anywhere in Beijing. Pretty soon the Americans didn't want to get off because they knew what the consequences were for the locals by the Red Guard. And the hotels had cracked toilets and rats running around, and they were high-class Motel 6s at best. Motel 6, and they just didn't have what it took, but they wanted those Yankee dollars. And at the time, the major export of communist China was wicker baskets. And so I'm like, oh, you gotta be kidding. And so she says, well, have some fun with it, just tell them what you think. And I'm like, okay. So I created a sort of a conservative viewpoint as distinct from libertarian, for William F. Buckley to escort tours around communist China to see really how bad communist China is. And what they would have to do to qualify for the Olympics would probably take them 20 years. And what they'd have to do is get Marriott and Hilton and so forth to build world-class hotels so that people would even want to endure being there. And so that was submitted, and the Tourism Bureau, bureaucrat threw it up to the Politburo, and the Politburo acknowledged every bit of it and said, do what this kid says to do. And they proceeded to do that. I think today, mainland China is about the second most popular tourist destination in Asia. I had been part of the Nixon stay home efforts because I didn't think a regime that had killed 56 million people as political prisoners was somebody who wanted to, let loose too much. And if you were going to trade with them, they'd probably wind up fascists instead of communists. They wouldn't understand what free market or personal liberty is all about, and did other interesting things to torque their hides. And I've beat them 2 or 3 times, and they beat me once. I'm still here. And in this young person's milieu, I was about 30, coming on 30 in 1984, and I'd stopped out and run digital adapters for the world. Was the ham radio people could take a dial-style radio and slave a frequency counter to it, and it would read out at 1,000 hertz. And if somebody else had one, you could almost whisper on a microphone instead of having to shout. And the secret police are in the back alley. Never sold them to police organizations or governments in the world, although I did make an exception for a couple astronauts. But I was doing that, and then I went to California, came back, and Tad and I got together working on things again. And so he brings down Arch Madsen, and I kind of, like a lot of these very powerful people Ted knew, I kind of knew who they were and I kind of didn't, and it was more of a matter of respecting their mind in a conversation. So he put the two of us together, and he explained his problem. And I said, well, right off the bat, I think I have a solution. And he said, what's that? And he'd explained his premises at length in what he wanted to do. And so I said, well, all the commercials are made for Maytags and Fords from last year. So if you ask them that they might like to make an investment in the future markets, perhaps, if markets are going to be opened, that they know what a Maytag or a Ford is, much less its wonderful features, and how lonely the Maytag serviceman is. So he just slapped his thigh and he says, oh, I love it. He just laughed. He says, that would actually work. And I go, sure, but all of Madison Avenue would line up behind you. Ask George Barris over here. He taught advertising. He was a real Madison Avenue guy. Reuben Bradley was a real New York PR guy. And there was Merwin Fairbanks in newspapers and Irwin Goodman in film and some others. And so they all thought this was a grand idea. So he went away happy, and that's what he did. And it went through several incarnations, but it's more and more out there. So in this time, we'd solve the problem pretty quickly, but he didn't want to leave. He wanted to talk some more. So I asked him about, at the end of World War II, and the beginnings of Radio Free Europe during World War II, and I'd studied the Office of Strategic Services. And he explained what it was like and tried to separate out good Germans from bad Germans, the National Socialists from people who weren't quite so suckered by their government, or said they were. And so he mentioned a fellow that had worked with him named Nick Clooney. And this was the brother of Rosemary Clooney, the singer-dancer, you might remember from It's a White Christmas with Danny Kaye and Bing Crosby. Very talented lady. And so I figured he was born in 1935, so he was only like 10 years old when World War II ended, but he was more of a Cold War era Radio Free Europe fellow. And so I kind of filed this away and other things. Nick Clooney, in the last few years, wound up starring in The Monuments Men, which was what to deal with all the stolen Nazi loot from museums and Jewish folks they confiscated and tried to fill their bad budgets up with, and the recovery of that. And so he kind of had this ambiance, and there's been a lot of movies on this era, but that was one of the better ones than The Good German or something. And so back around 20 years ago, I actually met Nick Clooney. And I told him this story about the Radio Free Asia thing as compared to Radio Free Europe, and he just leaned back and roared laughing, very tall fellow to me, and he just thought that was great. And he says, I wondered how he pulled that off, And so we talked a bit, and at this time, his son George Clooney was still a kid, and hadn't emerged. And but about 5 years ago, I saw Nick and his son George on the steps of some hearing with a lot of reporters crowded around with the star power of his son mostly. And the two of them talked very openly about helping people in a war-torn area with humanitarian aid, and if the warlords want to steal it all for their troops, that maybe it was time that there would be some sort of humanitarian mercenary corps or something that would go in and protect the food, because the United Nations couldn't seem to do that. And it was something really like, oh, you know, these guys are like listening to Arch Madson's non-governmental things. Now, Arch Madson, if you look him up on things, you'll see an article that he wrote either on imdb.com or on Google or something called Battlefield of the Mind. And it wasn't about psyops or fooling people. It was about persuading people honestly that you got something that they might not, and here's what it's like if you had it, and so forth. And its transparency was brilliant. That's the way he ran things. And he always would lament that whether it was Latter-day Saints not using satellite and television enough, KBYU seemed to be doing okay, still is, but there's a reluctance to confront bad people in the media. And if your own house is not in order and somebody criticizes you, deal with it, be open about it. And this was the kind of man he was, and I respected that. So if you read this essay, Battlefield of the Mind, it very much sounds like Tad Danielewski in a conflict between good and evil, and you really expose the bad and you really expose the good. And if you have a solution in freedom that puts food on people's table, gets them an education, their car isn't going to be repossessed, something like the percentages you earn in finance, you have coverage all the time because your income's erratic, and you're going to be doing these things. I found it fascinating that in crisis situations, I think it was Sudan and Ethiopia, they were having this hearing about, and Nick Clooney was an activist to do this, and he wasn't averse to sending U.S. troops in there, but they ought to all be volunteers and know what they're getting into. These Black Hawk Down things where you've got to take food back in an international force. Maybe the Pakistani tanks don't want to go and the Americans do, and it's all discoordinated and the good guys lose. So I've observed Nick Clooney as sort of an echo of Arch Madson. I don't know that much about his son George, and I don't know if either Nick Clooney or George Clooney or Rosemary Clooney ever met Ted Danielewski, although 1, 2, or 3 of them just might have. The clarity by which they talk sounded so much like Ted or Arch Madson. It was kind of amazing. So today, these lessons learned from these men, that women that Ted put us with, was that working on a 1-to-1, all federal candidates and gubernatorial candidates debate tourney. Learn about it on debatetourney.com. And the idea is that the audience can decide in phone vote who wins the debate, or none of the above, they're both clowns, and you move on to rounds. In 2020, for instance, there was 1,152 people that filed for the presidency, but ask yourself how many of those you ever heard about. And corporate interests and party hacks work for their cause through what's supposedly objective media, but is actually subjective. And so I became more or less in favor of multi-subjective opinions. And Arch Madson was not averse to having communists on his radio station so somebody could take issue with them. And one good example of his courage on this was, at the time, a book had come out called Citizen Tom Paine. And it was written by a communist named Howard Fast, who has many movie credits to his name, more of a socialist vein. And he's very honored in the Soviet Union, and had at various times had something to do with a variety of socialist westerns that bombed at the box office. But Howard Fast had challenged a conservative friend of his, you don't understand revolution. Your conservatism deadens all thinking. It's all about governmentality, like it is with me as a socialist. But you say you're for the free market. You say you're for personal liberty. But you couldn't put any revolutionary fervor behind that if you tried. And I dare you, you write a book on Thomas Paine and I'll write one, and we'll see which one captures the essence of the Republican Revolution of the 1770s and the French Revolution. Let's see if we can do that. So Fast wrote a book that actually succeeded. His conservative friend was at a loss. He couldn't even do it. And it remains one of the finer books, both historically accurate as well as some dramatic license, like when young Napoleon knocked on Tom Paine's door and he told him to go away. Had this maid tell him to go away. And he insisted that he read The Rights of Man and had a copy of Common Sense under his pillow and slept with it every night. So Paine says, well, okay, he was hungover, but I'll see the guy. He can't be all bad. And he captured those moments of Lafayette and Thomas Paine with a pistol and a sword defending Citizen Louis, the king, from getting beheaded. And they later achieved that, but at that time the crowd dispersed because they explained to him, he's just a citizen like the rest of us. Monarchy's over. And one could quote Rene Diderot as was done, that when humankind will be free when the last king is strangled with the entrails of the last priest. And those people that feel so deeply, this is what Howard Fast was trying to get across in the temples of reason and other sorts of things in France at the time, and the American privateers operating out of France in the Revolution. They were all rewarded. There was a third that went to the ladies and 2/3 that went to the crew. Now think about this for a production crew. When I was talking with Tad, that the captain might have a 20th, and he's got a 20th for merit pay of the 2/3. And when you get down to the cabin boys, you're talking, 8 decide to sign on, and they're going to be dividing 1/8 of 1/20th of whatever the captured ship is that they take. In the American Revolution, subscription defense was able to put some of these kids into the middle class. George Washington fought with the brown vests and the gunpowder that was captured. The idea of subscription defense, subscription media, subscription whatever it is you want to do, roads, common area management, does not have to be public or government. And I would talk with Tad about this, and Arch Madsen weighed in with me on the history of French subsidized media that, in his opinion, caused World War I and led to World War II. And they were criticizing free marketeers in Brazil and America and so forth, and how wonderful the government was to make their benefactors in the French assembly happy, and wandered them right into a government-controlled business, business-controlled government fascism, which typically with either Hitler or Mussolini wound up with 75% of everything owned by the government. And Stalin's Russia was a little worse than that, but about the same. And so all of these socialist ideas, Arch Madsen had discussions with Tad, and I got wind of those a little bit after my tete-a-tete with Arch Madsen. And Tad's 3 philosophies of personal liberty, cooperative intellectual property title. If you're going to cooperate, you do an agreement, you all agree to help each other, and one of you will emerge as a star or best writer or actor. And then his politics was such that he had some other things. Now, I think I made a video with some of my recollections of Mike Medavoy and the Olympics, the Olympic boycott by Carter. Tad expressed to me and I think to Arch Madsen that he thought Carter, who he liked, had made 2 great mistakes, that embassies are not to be trifled with. That's the foreign soil of another country, and they're there to talk with you no matter how much of an enemy they might be. And the second is something like it, that the Olympics is a peace armistice. And he had asked me if I knew anybody in the Reagan administration. I knew a speechwriter, Dana Rohrabacher, who wrote a lot of the high-toned, rough drafts, and then Reagan would make them better. And in 48 hours after submitting that to him with Tad's ideas, which may or may not have been influenced by Arch Manson, I don't know, because they talked quite a bit. And understand that Tad is not a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and Arch Manson is. And if you read his stuff, he looks at this war in heaven of people who force people to be good as the equivalent of somebody who tempts you to be bad or forces you to be bad. So your odds are, think of a Foursquare, are 3 against 1 for the Christian paradigm of doing good in freedom and organizing for it. And Tad liked that philosophy, although he wasn't a Latter-day Saint. So these two men conversed a lot. And if you're trying to figure out Arch Manson, you got to figure out Tad Danielewski, and if you want to figure out Tad Danielewski, I think you got to look at Arch Manson. But he's almost invisible in the media records. I mean, if you go to the LDS Church Historical Department and its Contracts Department, you'll see a lot of stuff, probably in Washington, D.C., same way, among the intel community. But I know that Arch Manson would be very hostile to the metadata data centers, these billion-dollar data centers in Bluffdale, Utah, Atlanta, D.C., and other places, spying all over Americans and anybody else. He would have thought that whoever did that are traitors to America, and he would have said so on Radio Free Europe, which would have probably got him fired, I suppose. But he was that kind of man, and he had a kind of an intellectual courage that way that Ted respected. So I was very fortunate in this one time that I got to stick with Arch Manson's mind to see that. So if you look at this battlefield of the mind, you'll see a little Latter-day Saint theology about a premortal existence and how we chose to be here with our minds blocked from our past to see what we're made of and how we might do good in freedom or not. And those people that are tempted in the name of a noble cause to force somebody else to do something, that is Luciferian philosophy, and Arch Manson would call it that on nationwide media if anybody bothered to interview him. So, as a man behind the camera, nevertheless, he was very influential. And that was kind of along the lines of what Tad's mission was to help us do stories. And in the case of freedom versus tyranny, use your head to think out a way. Don't just whine and react to the evildoer. If you want to defeat, 78 with Star Wars, if you want to defeat Darth Vader, you persuade him instead of shooting it up with him, because he might just win. But if you persuade him, that's better than a military victory. And another professor there, Owen Rich, who was a very brilliant man, was on his way to being a nuclear physicist. With the dropping of the A-bombs in World War II, I asked him, why did you go into communications? He says the same thing, that you could certainly be a nuclear engineer or a nuclear sub-captain. He says, I figure if we can talk to one another, we can keep the world from blowing up, and at least moving it from negative to zero might not be bad. And he and Tad and others were aware that I tried to pull together what I call the SDIA team, Strategic Defense Initiative team, with my Aunt Frances, who ran the technology and had 125,000 employees operating McDonnell aircraft and then later McDonnell Douglas. Took us to the moon. Most every jet fighter you ever found was mostly out of McDonnell. And it later merged with Boeing. But she didn't like what she was seeing, as her idea had sort of been hijacked by JFK that Mac McDonnell introduced her to. From '53, she was working towards a free market moon transit system, not a space program. And she thought everything cost 47 times what it ought to in the free market. And one of the things I got as a little feedback from Arch Manson through Tad Danielewski was in his creating this Radio Free Asia effort for as long as it lasted, was that it actually operated on a budget 1/3 of what Radio Free Europe did for comparable efforts and multi-language translations and everything. And I thought, well, there you go. So anyway, that was how Arch Madsen and Tad Danielewski had affected myself and efforts I'm doing today. And I thank Tad and I thank Arch and brilliant, wonderful men who care about freedom and the little guy. And I've always appreciated that. Thank you.